Okay, I'm going to bang this loud enough so the back row can hear. It is 6 o'clock, and it's time for the February 13th meeting of the Planning Commission to come to order. Call the roll.
Middleton.
Here.
Martin.
Here.
Abernathy. Here. Jones.
Here.
Hoskin.
Here.
Patel.
Here.
Clough.
Here.
You've received a copy of the minutes of the January meeting. Are there any corrections or additions?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Middleton.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Abernathy. Aye. Jones.
Aye.
Hoskin.
Abstain.
Patel.
Aye.
Clough.
Aye.
Are there any additions to the agenda or revisions?
Staff has none.
If there are no objections, I'm going to change the order and take old business first because there may be extended discussion on at least one of the items following. So, no objections?
No, sir.
Call for the site plan, if you will.
Site plan at 231 Newman Drive.
So the site plan at 231 Newman Drive has been on the agenda for some time and subsequently tabled. Staff met with the applicant a couple weeks ago, and they have successfully addressed all of staff comments. So with that, staff recommends approval action of the item.
Are there any questions or comments? Is there a motion?
Motion to approve.
A second.
Middleton.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Abernathy. Aye. Jones.
Aye.
Hoskin.
Aye.
Patel.
Aye.
Clough.
Aye.
Okay. Call number 5.
Amendment to section 14.1405A of the Sherwood zoning code.
So this next item for Board of Zoning Adjustment chapter within the zoning code was in relation to ordinance 2465 that was passed that increased the planning commission numbers as it relates to commissioners. So with that, staff went in and repealed the necessary sections within the zoning code and thought this would be an appropriate time to have a discussion as it relates to increasing the fee. So with that, it's pretty simplistic. What was provided, that would increase would be to $125. That includes the city covering the cost of the advertisement.
This calls for a public hearing. Does anybody out there wish to speak to this? Hearing none, call the public hearing closed. Discussion. Just my own sense of this is that $50 for a variance, which can usually take some serious time, is way low for the amount of time that's going to be involved with staff and commissioners.
Yeah, and based on the fee schedule they gave for surrounding cities, it looks appropriate to our neighboring cities here in the central Arkansas area, so I'd motion to approve.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Middleton.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Abernathy. Aye. Jones.
Aye.
Hoskin. Patel.
Aye.
Clough.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, before we move on, I just wanted to make, or for purposes of clarification, we jumped down to the old business, which I think was approved, but had we already had the public hearing on that at some previous time? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm good.
Yeah, and we tabled it back then because of the number of outstanding comments that weren't addressed, and we didn't want to approve it back then on contingency.
It's public hearing, and I wanted to make sure public hearing had happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably October, I think.
It was left on there as a precaution because the item has been tabled often to allow, if anybody did show up, the opportunity to speak.
That's fine, I just didn't want to
Okay.
miss that.
Thank you.
Discussion, chapter 1411 of the Sherwood zoning code.
All right, so this is a rewrite of the existing sign regulations. This is going to be taken to council for consideration, but we did want to bring it to y'all just for matters of discussion, for input, thoughts, concerns, questions, anything of that nature. The reasoning for essentially the rewrite in dealing with this at this current time is there's been concerns raised about sale signs. And sell, that means the flag signs, like sale, not sell. Problem with the English language. And then additionally, there was some concern raised over enforcement of the existing regulations. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing. Upon review of the ordinance, I had some observations after that, based on previous experience enforcing regulations of things that might be problematic here and there. And then, one of the things was sort of the extensive exemptions clause that exists within it. And so a lot of what this is in areas, it's not changing the essence or the heart of the regulations. What it is doing is restructuring, tweaking items, relaxing some regulations, tightening up language on some other things. So if you look at this, the regulations, we can kind of go through this briefly. 141101, purpose and scope. A lot of this is pretty much the same as what it was previously. There's some language that's been added. There are some, a citation of the authority in state law that essentially gives the authority to have these regulations. In the existing ordinance where it talks about policies, that's moved to a different section. So that's kind of the main theme of what's changed in that section. 141102, within this section, some of those policies that are talked about in the previous section are moved here. Things we keep or clarified are things like the message neutrality and substitution policy. That's important based on previous case law, Gilbert v. Reed. That's been further clarified in the Austin v. Reagan, the message neutrality. I think there might have been some small fuzzy things with the way that the existing ordinance is written that it might be interpreted, one might interpret that there's some favoring of some particular types of speech, but it's kind of a very extremely nuanced deep dive that I won't really necessarily get into. One of the main things here that was a concern was the lengthy list of exemptions. Based on attorneys that I've talked to in the past or presentations that I've sat through, one of the things that they express a lot of concern over is ordinances that have a ton of exemptions in them. That can be a basis for it being challenged in court. And the reason being is kind of where the current state of things is. The best that a city can hope for when its sign code is challenged is for it to be challenged under intermediate scrutiny. When there's a high level of exemptions, that has been used as a basis to then divert it into the issue of strict scrutiny. And so it's an evolving.
If I could
area of
interrupt
law.
you for just a second, especially for the newer board members or commissioners, you might go over very briefly the Reed decision and the difference between strict and intermediate.
Yeah, so essentially, when you're the Reed decision, so there's two key cases that have come out in the last several years. The first being Gilbert v. Reed, and it dealt with, honestly, one of the stupidest enforcement decisions I've ever seen a city do. And it was related to a temporary sign for a church. And they said, you can have a temporary sign for X, Y, Z, but you can't have it for this. And so they sued. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And basically, the holding was that it was discriminatory, it was restricted free speech, and so it was, ruled invalid on that basis. And the reason being is that it fell into strict scrutiny. And pretty much any sign regulation, if it falls under that level of strict scrutiny, it is going to be ruled invalid. The difference is intermediate scrutiny it has to be very narrowly tailored and serve a legitimate government purpose, something like aesthetics or health, safety, and welfare. And so it really is in a vein of let's reduce the number of exemptions and it just be based on these certain things. So that's the idea. Austin v. Reagan came after, and that was a challenge by the billboard companies to challenge Austin's off-premise regulations. It kind of had a mixed bag of results that came out of it.
And as a general rule, because of the Reed decision, virtually every city in the United States had to change their sign regulations. And we changed ours kind of late in the game, but everybody was still learning. This is an improvement over what we had.
And I think even we'll go back and look in 5 years and there'll be things that we can, that is the nature of regulations, that you write it trying to address a particular set of issues, new issues arise that you didn't think about previously, and so regulations constantly evolve in that respect. One of the big things that's additionally a change with these regulations is applicability. Rather than have a long list of exemptions that, say this, it basically says that these rules are applicable to signs that are intended to be viewed when you're driving down the road or walking down a sidewalk. And so when we think about things like a sign internal to a campus or an end cap or some type of sign that's on top of a gas pump, those are not things that are intended to be viewed by the public, and so that's not the intent of this regulation. It doesn't deal with any of that. And it's strictly to deal with those things that are in the public realm. And that's kind of that way around that exemption issue. When we look at this, the things like the artwork policy are retained. The off-premise, on-premise distinction is relatively similar. Sign area measurement. There's several items that we've gone in here, and one of the ways that we've made things, I think, more beneficial towards business is changing up the way that the height of signs is measured. There are instances where I think it's perfectly valid for a variance. If you've got a lot and the street's here and the building's down here, if we measure height, then you're going to result in a sign that is below street grade, when the whole purpose of signage is to be able for the motoring public to be able to see the advertising. And so we've changed it to where it can be measured from street grade so that you can see the sign. And there's instances throughout the community where you have those types of issues. And so providing some drawings that kind of clarify how height is measured, those sorts of things. Additionally, drawing that kind of indicates what street frontages are. That's oftentimes fairly confusing. We get into sort of the definition of maintenance that's on page 5. This is one of those things that's tightened up in the regulations. It's clarified exactly what maintenance is. If you're painting a support structure, that's maintenance. If you're exchanging lighting elements, changing a light bulb, that's maintenance. If you're changing the copy, that's maintenance. If you're changing the sign cabinet from one type of sign cabinet to a wholly new sign cabinet, that's not maintenance. And so those things are very clear in the way that this is structured. Additionally, the existing regulations deal with abandoned signs. In the new regulations, it has some standards for what an abandoned sign is. And it's like if there's not a use that's being occupied on the site for 90 days, it has become an abandoned sign. Presently, the way that it's handled is if it's an abandoned sign, the whole sign has to come down. The way that this is moving to, if it's an abandoned sign and it conforms, you have to just remove the sign face. If it's non-conforming, then that's the point at which the whole sign comes down. And so that's one of the, I think, main things, a big difference there. As it relates to permit requirements on page 6, one of the things that's passed in the last couple of years is the Fast Track Permits Act. And it essentially requires action on any kind of administratively granted permit within 60 days. And that administrative action is either going to be approval, denial, or request for revisions. And so we wrote this section, the existing section is pretty close to being compliant with it. This then now includes that requirement that you have to do the X, Y, and Z within a certain time frame, and that you have to provide, if the applicant requests an explanation in writing, that has to be provided. That's something that's in state law, so we included it with that. As we go, the fees are different. One of the issues that you sometimes have is, there's a lot of great sign companies out there. Not every sign company is a good actor, and so we put a penalty in there for unpermitted work that basically adds a rider that if you do unpermitted work, then you're going to have X amount of additional sign permit fee that's going to be tacked on for doing that unpermitted work. And so that's meant to discourage that. That's also kind of a way of attacking sort of issues, code enforcement issues, without going through the full code enforcement process of issuing a citation, going to court, then, saying a fine or trying to go through the compliance. That it's basically like, hey, you violated the code, you got to pay this additional fee on top of this to resolve this. A lot of the signs not requiring permits on page 8 are pretty similar. We've addressed window signs as being different from wall signs as part of the regulations. That's another thing. Construction and design standards. A lot of this is very similar from the previous regulations. We did add some tightened up language that deals with interference of utilities, like signs not being within 5 feet of a hydrant or within a utility's designated safety zone. There's language in there now that talks about not interfering with utilities, but this specifically, if we've got standards from First Electric or North Little Rock Electric on what their designated utility zone is, that's something that's enforceable for us to say, no, you have to stay X number of feet away, rather than just a general requirement. Additionally, we say no signs and easements. There is a little bit of flexibility with that. If there's no other feasible location for a sign, then in the enforcement officer's determination, they can say, well, you can place a sign on the easement. But it has to be that there's no other possible location for this. And then some of there's a difference in the way that temporary signs are treated. In the existing regulations, it's got a sort of a list of all these various signs. In this, it's got a table. So there's a table, and then when it says temporary signs, when a building or parcel or lot is under construction or renovation, all of the relevant portions of regulations are right there. One of the things that was a little bit confusing about the previous structure is that there were standards that applied to a wall sign, and then you had a section that said where wall signs were allowed. And so you had to read this and you had to read this to know what was allowed. And so it was flipping back and forth, and so it could get a little bit confusing. As it relates to temporary signs, it's based on the activity that's going on the property. So we can't regulate the content of signs, so we say you can have a temporary sign when a property is for sale or lease. We're not regulating what the content of that is. 99% of people, when their property is for sale or lease, are going to put a real estate sign. That's most likely what they're going to put up. Similarly, if it's under construction, you get an allowance for a sign in that situation. Most people in most situations are going to put up some type of construction sign. That's typical. Same with election signs. The allowances for election signs, most people are going to put up an election sign, but we don't regulate the content of it. That's the whole thing with temporary signage. There is no regulation of content whatsoever. It does not matter what it says. It matters the size of it, the location of it, the number of them. We do have a permit required type 2. These are for general temporary signs. We've got a maximum, this is on page 11. We've got a maximum size of 36 square feet for type 2 general temporary signs. This is what deals with feather flags and sale signs. For these, they're either going to be like a banner stuck on the wall of a building, or they're going to be close in by the building. In the treatment of banners, the treatment of feather flags, sale signs, it's all handled very similar, that they're all kind of up close to the building, a little bit more neat and tidy. In looking on page 12, signs allowed in plan unit developments and special districts. Every time I've ever reviewed a plan unit development, the developers never brought in a sign package at the time that it was approved. And that's how a lot of regulations are written, that the signs will be approved with the PUD. That seldom if ever happens, and so this provides a flexibility that they can either provide a sign package at the time that the PUD is approved, or they can petition Shelby for it to be reviewed as a C3 district area or a C2 district area. And if Shelby's like, yeah, that seems to be very consistent with the context of the development, then they're allowed to have signage that's consistent with that zoning district. Next, in residential districts, we've got allowances for neighborhood entry signs, multifamily development entry signs. And then another big thing is for non-residential uses. So if we're looking in R1, R2, R3, R4, things like daycares, things like churches, things like institutional uses like parks, those are going to have larger signs. They're going to tend to have signs that are more commercial in nature. And so we've got provision for wall signs on those types of structures, and we additionally have provision for freestanding signs. Those are the types of signs you're going to normally see, and so I think that was probably an inadvertent oversight of the existing regulations. With signs in commercial districts, as it relates to freestanding signs, this is an area where it's liberalized a little bit. We're retaining the same provision of monument signs, but the size of a monument sign depends on the size and acreage of the lot. If you're a standard, 5 acres or less, then you've got 8 feet tall and 64 square feet. If you go to a larger property, it goes a little bit taller and a little bit larger. If you go to a 20-acre site, it goes a little bit larger and a little bit taller, all the way up to something like a regional scale development. So when we think about a regional scale development, thinking about where Main Street Furniture is. You've got multiple building sites, it's one cohesive development, and so you get a pretty large sign for that type of site. It's meant to be kind of one of the key destinations in your community, and so for regional scale development, you get a pretty large sign associated with that. In addition, each of the individual lots can have their own smaller monument sign that's associated with it. The other big change from the existing regulations to the new proposed regulations is there was a provision on walls for one wall sign. This has changed to provision for wall signs on any facade of the structure up to 10% of that facade wall. So we don't limit the number of them. We just say you've got 10% if you've got wall signs, if you've got window signs, if you've got projecting signs, all these signs. You can have as many as you want, but it has to add up to no more than 10% of the facade area. And so one of the big issues is, like, let's say, for instance, a Taco Bell. Taco Bell, they like to come in, they like to have a sign on the front, they like to have a sign on the side, they like to have a sign on the side. And so that forces us into a situation where permitting for something like a new Taco Bell would require a variance. And honestly, the sign packages for Taco Bell are not offensive. And I'm speaking directly from experience that I had in Conway, because I had this specific issue. I was like, why wouldn't we allow Taco Bell to have signs on 3 sides? And so that kind of relates to that. So that's one of the big areas where there's, I think, a liberalization with this in a way that makes sense. On page 15, we talk about electronic message centers. There's some existing regulations on electronic message centers. With this, it caps the size of the portion of a sign that may be electronic message center, and then adopts basically some sign industry standards as it relates to illumination and message display. So the industry, they recommend that you have no more than 0.3 foot candles of illumination above the ambient light level. So if it's a really bright day, that means the sign can be really bright. When it's really dark at night, the sign has to be automatically dim, but it varies based on the ambient light level. And that's one thing that I think is big from the existing, when it says it has to be able to dim at dusk and dawn, is there are a lot of very cheap electronic message center signs that have those abilities, but they don't maintain that light meter, and that's really critical. You'll see those light meters oftentimes on some of the billboards that don't look so glaringly bright for the digital billboards. The other thing is sign copy change. It allows sign copy change every 8 seconds. And so that's kind of the industry standard that they talked about in terms of safety, that if you've got a message that changed that often, that it's not something that's creating too great of a distraction for drivers. Additionally, there's a creation of the freeway sign zone. This is pretty much the same concept of what we had is in C3 or C4 along in these areas. It's got some specific provisions. Those are where the tall signs are allowed for tall pole signs. Additionally, it allows for, maintains the same requirements for billboards. There are some additional requirements on limiting size based on billboard industry standards. And then there are some slight additional requirements here that for addressing digital billboards. So it does not allow any additional digital billboards unless there is removal of one of the, I think, 3 or 4 existing billboards within the city outside of the 167 corridor. When I looked, I think that's pretty much North Sherwood that has a couple of those existing ones. And so those conversions, and it's got some additional standards on digital billboards as well. Some of the larger billboard companies, this is one of their normal practices. They've had engaged in these types of agreements with the city of Little Rock and various other cities. The large billboard companies have moved to 1,000-foot spacing standards, where some cities have had 500-foot spacing standards. They've realized there's too much clutter with that number of billboards, and so they've gone in to enter these agreements to get rid of some of those with converting to digital. And so it's trying to encourage that type of thing of removing those existing billboards that are in parts of North Sherwood. And then additionally, where the existing regulations talked about requesting deviations, this provides for an alternative signage plan that has some very specific criteria of when you would request an alternative signage plan. That's outside of the possibility of going through variances. This reinstates seeking variances for signage, which is kind of the statutory mechanism for that. Additionally, 141105 talks about non-conforming signs. There's a little bit more nuance to the way that it deals with non-conforming signs. One of the things that is a key provision of this is if let's say we're moving to the standard citywide where we're trying to encourage monument signs. When I worked in the city of Fayetteville, there was this muffler shop that was right on College Avenue, and they came in and they wanted to get a new sign, and their sign was ugly as all get out. I mean, it was a nasty looking sign. And I said, okay, well, here's the thing. It's going to have to come down in height, and then we're going to measure it from the Master Street Plan right-of-way. And so you'll get to have a sign that's about 30 feet that way, and it's going to be a lot smaller. And they're like, well, I'm not doing that. And so this was 17 years ago. They still have the same sign, the same butt ugly sign. And so to deal with that particular issue is if you've got an existing legally non-conforming sign, if you bring it towards conformance where it's 75% of the height and 75% of the size of the existing non-conforming sign, you can get a new permit for what would be otherwise non-conforming. So if you've got a 30-foot pole sign and you come down 75% of that height, we're gonna, it's meant to gradually retire those, that encourage people to modify their signs. That was a practice that we had in Conway that was very effective, because Conway had a lot of old pole signs before we switched to monument signs. And then additionally, when dealing with violations, one of the things here that it sets up is if we've got a repeat offender on sign code offenses, the minimum penalty goes up. So if you're on your second offense, your third offense, if you're just gonna keep violating the code, the penalty's gonna go up. Obviously, there's some statutory limits on that, but it sets that up. And then finally, it talks about schedule of fees. This is structured in a way that in the body of the text, it talks and it says the city council will set a schedule of fees. Knowing that doesn't exist currently, we have this section in here that basically says, fees will be determined by a schedule adopted by the city council. If they don't have a fee schedule, this is what the fees are. And so this is meant that in the future, when we do shift to an adopted fee schedule that is easily updated, we can just take this out in the future, so. You got a James diatribe, but there you go.
Well, this may surprise those of you who know me, but I do have some questions. But I'll open the floor for discussion. Anybody else who has questions or suggestions or comments? Overall, I'd say this is a very good effort. I like it. A couple of things that I really like, and I would like to see more of diagrams and sketches in there. Graphics really, if there's any part of the zoning code where graphics would make a whole lot of sense, it's in this one. So if there are more, I'd love to see them. Does anybody else wish to say something?
Yeah, I had a question. Who actually goes out and enforces these sign laws? Is there someone that goes out and inspects how bright a sign is and?
So it's going to be a combination of Lon, who does a lot of the permitting. Typically, those enforcement issues are usually complaint-driven.
Okay. And I guess the same question kind of applies to abandoned signs, you know, who says, okay, it's been 90 days, you know, that sign's got to come down.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that you have to kind of verify with photographic evidence, and so it's typically much longer than that. We had one of those issues where there was a business that had been out for 3 or 4 years, and at that point, it was like, well, we can just look on Street View and we know. And told them, hey, you've been long gone. So that's good for me. Thanks.
So a couple quick things. First, just to make sure I understood it, anyone that's in violation or that would incur a fee for unpermitted signs, it would be the sign company, correct? That would be
So
held for
the-
that, or is it the person who submitted the permit application? to the
There's
sign?
additionally a big change with this. In here, it's written that responsibility for violations are pretty much anybody that we can stick it to. It's anybody that has implied authority over the sign, or was responsible for the installation. And the reason why is, when I was in Conway, we dealt with an issue where the sign company was not communicating with the business owner. And they went out and did work, and the business owner was like, oh, well, they just told me this is what we were allowed to do. And then they were completely blindsided. And so this does allow us to go after the sign company if in the situation, it's pretty clear that they were the ones driving the violation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So my other comment is on page 11 with the free, where we've got the permit required type 2 under the C districts and some O districts. We've got non-residential use of the temporary signs and the feather flag signs. I think where we're talking in that last paragraph where we've got location and installation, we're referring to a sign not extending to the roof, beyond the roof line or structure on which it's attached. I think we probably ought to say or serving or something to that effect, because the feather signs aren't attached typically.
Yeah,
So-
I got you.
On section 141103A, says that signs shall only be permitted upon lots, parcels, or buildings which are not vacant. Does that mean vacant lots or vacant buildings, or both?
That would be vacant lots. Well, it would be both. It would be both. It's applicable to both. If there's not presently something there, then no.
Then you might put something like either or,
Okay.
just to clarify that.
Which page is that again?
That's on page 503A, last sentence.
Okay.
And on B4, signs painted or attached to fences. See a lot of fences where the installer of the fence has a small little sign on the fence. Does it include those? And is this any sign whatsoever?
I would say those are not intended to be viewed by somebody driving down the road since they're so small. I'd normally see that as, the intent of that is if somebody goes up to the fence, and they're like, that looks like a really nice fence, who built that? That's what I view the intention of those types of signs.
Okay, on number 11 there. And this is a small detail, but my experience has been that when you peg something to the right-of-way in most places is very variable. So, and it could be hard to measure the distance from that. You might consider, and I'm just throwing this out, a distance from the center line, which is a lot easier to measure. I know one city that pegged their annexation of territory to the right-of-way of a highway, and it went all over the place, and they didn't realize that.
You caught something that I hadn't changed, so I appreciate that. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I do want to note that it applies to US Highway 167, also known as future Interstate 57.
We can always be hopeful.
It's happening. It's going to be very soon. So I'm excited for the day.
And on C3A and B, where it says a schedule of fees adopted by the city council, why don't we just change that to refer to section 141108? That way there can be no confusion. The fees are as they are at 08. And I have a little concern about the signs during an election window, because the way it reads is that any sign, any temporary sign where a permit is not required of any kind can be put up in that window. Is that what you mean? I mean, it pulls in some that you really didn't intend because of the election window, and we all know what that's for.
I think from a standpoint of, is it possible to enforce content-neutral regulations during an election? It's pretty much impossible. So that's not a widely, I don't think that's something we're gonna go out and say,
Yeah.
hey, John Q. Public, this is.
There may be
something-
some signs put up that don't have anything to do with the election that are sneaking under the window, but
Yeah, I mean,
I just wanted to
if I
point
were
that
putting
out.
up a sale sign during an election, that would be, that would not be a great investment during that period, because there's a lot of noise. They get lost, yeah.
okay. Also in the temporary signs where a permit is not required, I was just a little confused on the garage or yard sale because it speaks to the lot, but what about off-site signs?
It does not inclusive of off-site, does not permit those,
So, does not permit them.
correct.
Is that well, I'll look at it again. On the planned unit development, I think it would probably be a good idea to make a modification to section 140808, which is the planned unit development chapter, and it speaks to modifications. And if you put something at that section that specifically authorizes that, that would be a good thing, so that there's no confusion about whether you can or can't. These signs allowed in residential districts, item C, a little concern about for the non-residential uses and a monument sign. What about for a home occupation? Are we going to permit a monument sign?
What page are we on?
That's on page 5.
Those home occupations would be non-residential, would be a residential use.
I think that needs to be clarified. And this is just a suggestion based on some confusion that I know we've had in the past, where you've got the section where it says up to 5 acres, and then 5 acres or more. That means 5 acres can go either way. The same with the 20. It would be a little clearer, at least to me, and less confusing if you said up to or less than 5 acres, and 5 acres or more, less than 20, or 20 or more, and just to be more precise. The freeway zone, calling it a zone basically suggests that it's an overlay district. And it would make sense to be an overlay district because the language in overlay district says the purpose of an overlay district is to allow the application of specific regulations to a distinct geographic area. And what's happening on either side of the freeway, future interstate, is that it's cutting across a lot of different zoning districts. So either we don't use the word zone and say it's just 150 feet or whatever distance, either from the center line or from the right-of-way, or we call it an overlay zone and refer back to this distance or put the distance in there. Either way, as long as there's cross connection there.
Yeah, I'll probably refer to as an area.
I have a concern about in the digital billboards in section E, where it says after January 1st, 2024, this is not going to be adopted until a month or so. Won't that make it ex post facto?
It's highlighted, it essentially is meant to be in there for whatever date it becomes applicable. So
Okay.
it'll be edited.
I only have a couple more. One of the things that we had in the current regulations was that if a chain store had signage, then we could grant an exception or not maybe a variance, but we could acknowledge that they had a corporate requirement to do some kind of signage. And I didn't really see that being specifically allowed. I think that's something that staff could clearly approve, or if it went above a certain margin, they could bring it to the planning commission, but it wasn't clear that you could do that.
But we did something like that recently with the
Yeah,
car wash.
splash pad.
The Splash.
splash,
Is that what the name of it? The car wash on Keelan, close to Brockington.
yeah.
Yeah, it's been my experience that chains can as easily modify their signage package as a local business can. And I kind of personally had some heartburn about providing some level of favor for somebody that's an out-of-state business or an out-of-city business compared to a local business.
Well, the current language is that you can't deviate more than 10%. So it put a cap on big signs that you wouldn't ordinarily allow. So that's something to think about. And you had explained the basis of the 75%, so I don't have a question there. Under violations, you had a clause in there about the enforcement officer may cause the code enforcement officer to issue a citation. And enforcement officer is defined in the definitions, but code enforcement officer isn't, and I wasn't sure what that means.
Yeah, it relates to the current structure of the way that that the enforcement officer is largely referring to planning and permit staff, and a code enforcement officer is referring to the code enforcement officer who would normally be the one who has the sort of the authority to issue citations. So I can certainly clarify that to where it's,
Or if you put a definition of enforcement officer, it's a little bit clearer. But anything that would clear that up, because at some point, who's doing this and why?
yeah, I think it'd probably be easiest to add a definition of, there is a definition of enforcement officer currently. It would be adding one for code enforcement officer.
Yes. And under penalties, you may need to adjust the wording in Chapter 141504, which defines the penalty for any violation of the zoning code, not less than $50, no more than $500, and perhaps put something in there except as otherwise noted, because it's different from what we've got here. And that's all I got. But I'll say it again, this looks real good.
I have a quick question. What was it? What about for buildings that don't have frontage, like it said for wall? That they needed to have like a wall sign, or it needed to be closer to the building? What about?
That's for temporary. That's
Just for temporary?
Yeah.
Okay. So if it's a permanent sign and you've got a building that sits in the back, that particular sign can be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that situation that I think there's some type of frontage there, correct? You're talking about, is there existing frontage? Yeah, so they're allowed the signage. I think additionally, those are types of instances where if there is, assuming that you've got a business that it's a lot and it somehow does not front on a public street or a publicly accessible fire apparatus road, which when we're talking about a publicly accessible fire apparatus road, what we're talking about is basically an access easement to that business. That would be an exceedingly rare instance where that would occur, because pretty much every commercial development, if there's multiple sites, there's some type of easement or public fire apparatus road that takes you back to where the other building is. So that's where and that's one of the main reasons for that allowance is when you look at these multi-site commercial developments, hopefully what we'll have kind of up there at Brockington and 107 on the northeast side, that you're going to have a lot of different lots, and not all of them are going to have frontage on either one of those roads. And they're not all going to have just roads through there. They're going to have access easements. And so providing signage opportunities for those folks, because they do need internal signage to that. So.
I have one quick question. On page 15, electronic message centers, on illuminations, a sign shall be equipped with dimming technology that automatically adjusts the display brightness. So when they come to get the sign permits, do you check if that sign has those technologies?
Yeah, so that'll be part of the application package. Is that's a piece of information that they're required to provide, is basically what brand of sign is this? What are the capabilities of it? Because there are, like I said, there are signs that you can buy online that are fairly cheap, that they'll say they have dimming, or they don't have that light sensor that's associated with them. And so that's like the main thing, is just checking to make sure it's got a light sensor that equips it to be able to check what the ambient light level is. Because even when you're even thinking about it, if you're in an area that has a lot of street lights, And if it's, you're saying it's gotta be set at this, well, the streetlights are gonna modify how bright that seems. And so it's all about kind of the perception of, in the amount of light pollution that exists around it, whether that's the sun creating pollution to that experience or whatever, that it's based on the ambient level.
I want to go back to page 19 on this whole thing about the enforcement officer and the code enforcement office. In B1, it says, in cases of an emergency, the enforcement officer may cause the immediate removal of a dangerous or defective sign without notice. And then down in section C, signs in the public right-of-way, says in cases of illegal signs placed in the public right-of-way, the enforcement officer may cause the code enforcement office.
That should be officer, yeah.
Well, why do we need a second person to have to go remove the sign? If the code officer can cause the immediate removal of a dangerous or defective sign without notice, can the same person just remove the illegal sign?
Either can, yes. And the point of that is, some of that is, it's more to talk about the structure of who's required to do what. And the idea of this is that the code enforcement would be out there patrolling to see if there are snipe signs, temporary signs that people are just putting out in the right of way. And so that is the main reason why that's there, is that it's indicating that's the responsibility of the code enforcement officer to pick up those little temporary signs that are everywhere around. That's the reason that's there. It's not meant to cause a whole another layer of bureaucracy.
And once the enforcement officer is defined, maybe that will clarify that.
Yeah.
So I had one other quick clarification that came about because of one of your comments, Mr. Chairperson. So on page 16, where we're talking about digital billboards and we have the date in there, like, is the date even necessary? Because when this gets adopted, it applies to all new signage at that point, correct?
I mean, that's a good question. I think there's gonna be a question of whether or not we wanna, whether or not the council really wants to set that or not. When this was written, it was originally contemplated that this was gonna be, January 1st. And so, it may not be that it's even necessary, like you're saying, or there may be a desire of the council to have it that says that provision is
To
gonna
delay
take
it.
effect on June 30th.
Some point in the future. Yeah, that would make sense then if they choose to do that, but otherwise I would think we'd take it out.
And I want to speak to Just for a second about the sale signs. And that was a big issue when the council took it up, when the first amendments were taken. It was almost unanimous. But I like the way this treats those sale signs as temporary signs, because that in fact is what they are. And I like the fact that they're temporary with a permit and restricted to non-residential zones. To me, that just makes a whole lot of sense. If I have heartburn on those kinds of signs, it really and truly is the bunch of them along an arterial, because they achieve their purpose, they distract you. And on an arterial at high speeds, 40 miles an hour or more, that's dangerous. So I like the fact that, okay, one, and keep it out of the right of way. I like it. Having heard all of this, I would like to request that staff schedule a public hearing for next month, because I think we're far enough along that with a few adjustments that you'll be making, and make sure that the final document gets out in plenty of time so people can see it, if you would, or if that's agreeable to you all.
I was gonna make a suggestion, just being a business owner in the city of Sherwood, when this goes public, to just make it very accessible to business owners, because I've been here for 12 years, and sometimes it's hard to find things. And you go start putting signs up, and you've got a business, and you think you're free to do certain things, and then you come and are shocked because you're like, I didn't see that, or, luckily, Creative Signs does a really good job now. If I go in there, they're like, okay, you can do this, this is what you can't do, and that type of thing. But it's very hard to find the do's and don'ts of the city and certain things, especially when you're new to the city.
Sure, certainly.
Any other comments or questions?
Just to follow up on the sale signs that you just brought up, am I understanding that the sale signs will not be allowed in the residential areas?
So general temporary, type 2 signs are permitted.
Where's that at? I guess that's it.
So
They're for non-residential use.
if you go to page 11, so they're allowed in C1, C2, C3, C4, O1, O2, CSC, and I1.
Because the reason I'm asking is because I've seen those being used for open houses,
Yeah,
like they're placed in the front yard. I've not seen them here in Sherwood, but I've seen them in other cities. So those, under what we've got, the current structure we have right now, those would not be allowed under our rules. Is that-
what they would be allowed during something like an open house is basically something 6 by 6. So they can have a 6 by 6 sign.
But can they have one of those sale signs up?
It's I mean, they'd be permitted some type of general, I mean, just to, if it's 6 by 6, it fits in that window, so I don't know. Okay. I mean, no more than 6 square feet.
Okay.
6 feet tall, so. I don't know exactly how big a cell sign is.
That's not either.
Yeah.
I didn't get out and measure the ones I saw before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's a good question, because I always assumed that it was 6 feet square. But it could be 6 feet at the bottom of the mast and 6 feet up, and then 7 feet, or 7.5. Pythagoras got to me.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out exactly the size of those the typical ones,
Yeah, because that's gonna come up.
yeah.
Motion to
Anything else?
adjourn.
Well, is there any new business? Hearing none. Second?
We got to the end.
A second.
Sorry. I was ahead of you. Thought we were done for the end.
Middleton,
Aye.
Martin,
Aye.
Abernathy.
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Hoskin, Patel.
Aye.
Clough.
Aye.
It's,